Thank you so much, Louai. What we're going to do now is bring both Becky and Louai back and start our Q&A portion. So I'm going to start with a question for research opportunities. Did you along the way, or did you already know what to do beforehand? And anyone who wants to go.
I think, you know, that is a pretty easy answer. I knew nothing, especially early on in any of the new research environments I was in. I'm guessing Louai would probably say the same, although he is one of the smartest people that I know. So, but no, you learn from the people that are in the lab, and you learn by literally following behind them and doing exactly what they're doing. And there are a million little steps, and eventually it becomes something that you kind of can do in your sleep. But I remember that first summer, I did this same protocol many times, and every single time I would write all the steps in the lab notebook, and eventually that's how I learned it, is because I just did it over and over again and forced myself to kind of write it down.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one thing you realize being in research is that a vast part of research is just like failing or feeling like you don't know what to do. You just gotta kind of stick to it and apply the scientific method and seek help from others, and you know, have good.
Thank you both. I'm going to combine a couple of questions. So someone asked, how can you be accepted into a research program? Bianca asked, when applying for research opportunities, you have to have a certain level of experience. So when applying for research opportunities, what strategies do you think you use or applicant for these programs?
Yeah, I mean, when I applied to this 10-week research internship, I had zero experience in the lab. You know, in my personal statement, I talked about the biology lab classes that I took and the chemistry lab classes I took, and my experience and why I was interested in it. And, you know, I relied also on the letters of rec that my professors have provided, because I really had no experience whatsoever. And that's why I think some of these internships are kind of a great first experience to get, because then it just makes it easier for the next one that you're looking for.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, it sounds like we had a very similar first research experience with that same National Science Foundation program, which, as Louai showed you that website, there are a lot of different types of opportunities. And I think relying on people like Olivia, who have taken other students through this process and know the resources, will be really helpful. And once you get that, just like Louai said, once you get that first research experience, then you have something to talk about and you have something to put on your resume for the next one. And it really opens doors.
So we'll move on to another question. Both of you talked about mentorship to a significant extent. So Catalina asked, how does the mentorship search relate to competition with other students? So I imagine along the lines of, are students competing with the same mentor? Are there particular mentors that are in demand? So it might be hard to catch that mentor's eye.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And you know, the answer that I want to give is that it kind of all just works out. But I know that's probably not very helpful. I think, you know, when you are a student and you're looking for a mentor, there are certain things about your personality, and everybody's different, that you kind of need to learn to recognize what will work well. Are you someone who needs a mentor who's going to be very direct with you, that, you know, and give you direct feedback? Are you someone who needs a little bit more space? And thinking about those things in advance, talking to people who have been through it, and trying to kind of suss that out as you're looking at different kind of possibilities. And I think the reason that I say it kind of just works out is because I think that different students are looking for different things. And it hasn't been my experience, at least, that there is so much competition for the same mentor.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think like when there's kind of different levels of mentorship too. When you join a lab as an undergraduate, you're usually paired with like a senior research member, such as a grad student or a postdoc, and they kind of mentor you on the day-to-day things. And then you'd usually meet with, say, the professor on more of an infrequent basis and talk about big picture things. So there's kind of, several layers to that. And yeah, and I would echo Becky in saying that it also depends on the student. For instance, in the PhD, some students really want a professor who's hands-on and very involved in their research. Others want a hands-off kind of professor. So what's really important is also finding someone who's good for your personal kind of needs.
I'm going to ask one of Catalina's other questions because I think it's a good one. If you could go back, is there a part of your path that you would skip, do differently, or spend more time on?
I think I'll take a stab at this. I think for me, I would probably tell my 25-year-old self to just not worry so much. I think at every step of the way, I questioned if I was good enough and if I was doing the right thing. And what I've learned, it's always easier looking back, but what I've learned is that really you make something out of the experience that you're in, and you can make a really positive experience come from just about anything, and it can open doors that you didn't even know that you could open.
Yeah, I have a very similar experience. I think, when I got into Stanford and, I was preparing to come here, I thought, I was like, oh man, what am I going to be doing with like these Stanford students? Because I had this stereotype like genius, student at these elite universities. But when I came here, what I really found is everybody's just a normal person that's just passionate and works hard. There's nothing extremely special about any of us here at Stanford or Harvard or MIT. If there are geniuses, they're a small fraction. The majority of the people are just, people who are driven and, passionate about what they do.
We're going to piggyback off another question. Someone asked about how do you balance doing schoolwork and research at the same time? I think this could be modified. Becky, for you, managing clinical and research responsibilities, and obviously Louai, you had to balance schoolwork and research. So how do you pursue long-term significant research experiences that might take up a lot of time at the same time that you're going along your academic path or clinical path?
I think in general, you just have to take one piece at a time, because I'm the type of person who, if I try to imagine all of the things that are on my to-do list, it feels quite overwhelming and I can get a bit of activation paralysis. But if I just start ticking away at my list, doing the next thing that's the most important, eventually you get through everything. But it does take some work to learn how to manage your time. I mean, for me, it has been this kind of balance between, the clinical medicine and the lab, and I still struggle with it, quite honestly. It's not, I don't think it's something I'm ever going to figure out. It's just going to be a little bit different depending on the current situation.
Yeah, I think it's important to also kind of develop a plan, like have a plan for what are the things that you really need to get to the next step. And if you can actually have a mentor who helps you and advises you on that, I think is really important. In terms of time management in the PhD, I mean, you only take classes in your first year, maybe a few classes in your second year, and then the rest, as far as your PhD, is just spent, working on your research. And for the most part, you drive that the way you want. You make the plans for your research along with your mentors. So there's not a lot of schoolwork you have to worry about.
We also have a question about what sorts of things would a student need to do in order to be a strong intern in their first lab and maybe lead to a good letter or recommendation. And I would also phrase this question as both of you have mentored students in the past, and what sorts of characteristics would you look for in order to write a good letter of recommendation in your mentees?
That's a very easy one. And it's really determination and just showing that you care. It's not at all about a successful experiment. You're churning out data. It's, you know, you say you're going to commit to this much time and you actually follow through, and you actually seem like you really care to do well and have like take pride in your work. I think to me that's way, way more important than, you know, someone who's really talented technically or the experiments are doing well.
Yeah, I think that there are just to piggyback a little bit on what Louai said, I definitely agree. There are the easy things like showing up on time and, you know, carrying through on your responsibilities. And then there are the intangible things, which is just being curious and being someone who's easy to work with and who's a team player. And, you know, you can't necessarily teach that. But the people the students that I've worked with who have really kind of shined are not always the ones who know the most. It's the people who show up and are eager and interesting and easy to work with.
I also have a question specific for Becky about MD PhD programs. So obviously you can be an MD and still do research. Our PI is an MD and does research. So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about why you committed to the MD PhD program and how that sort of changed your outlook on physician scientists as a profession.
Yeah, I know so many MDs who do amazing research, including our PI, Dr. Makel. And so I don't think you necessarily need the degree to be a good physician scientist. I personally chose it, you know, in part because I really almost had a hard time deciding. I really liked research and I wanted to commit to that. But I also kind of had this idea in my head that I wanted to go to medical school, even though honestly, I didn't know that much about what that entailed. And I'm so glad that I did, looking back on it. So I think it can be, and you know, there are some, I know people who have taken a path where they do a PhD and then an MD, or the opposite way, or, you know, you can do an MD and a Master's of Public Health, for example, right? Where you're learning how to do like public health research and epidemiology a little bit like Panos does. And there are so many different ways to find a niche of research. And I think just talking to people who have taken those various paths and figuring out what seems to make the most sense for you, and knowing that you can change your mind as you go through the process.
Thank you, Becky. We also have a question here about self-doubt. I know that, Becky, you addressed this a little bit. And in our last seminar, we also talked about imposter syndrome that happens at every stage in the career. So maybe you each could talk about how that manifests now, even far along the career path, and then, you know, how that influences how you make your next plans, what you believe you can do and what you can achieve.
Yeah, I mean, it could be kind of I think a roller coaster. I think you have your good days and your bad days. I think how it's different before than it is now. Before, when I'd have self-doubt, I wouldn't know, I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to get over it. Now, having gone through that so many times, each time it comes up, it's not as intimidating because I know that eventually things, you know, will come around and we'll be able to get over it. So I think that's how things have changed.
Yeah, imposter syndrome is very real. I've experienced it at every step of my career, including where I am right now. And I sometimes almost get angry with myself that I still feel that way. And I do think it gets a little bit less over time because I know what to do, which is just whatever the next thing on my plate is, you know, keep going and keep working hard. And in some ways, I think it's good to have a little bit of self-doubt, because if you didn't, then you're probably not doing it right. So allow that to just be part of the process and part of your journey, because I don't think it's always a negative thing.
Great. And then a question I also wanted to ask, both of you work very hard. And I also wanted to ask, following up on what Becky had at the end of her presentation, how you achieve this work-life balance. So at the same time that you're spending long hours in the lab or long hours in clinic, seeing patients, making time for family and friends and community and self-care, what does that look like for each of you?
Yeah, for me, this is one of the things that I'm kind of most passionate about, because I knew going into this, when I started this dual degree program that I knew was going to lead to a long career, that I was not going to wait until my training was done to start my life. I was very determined to continue the things that I was passionate about outside of medicine, because I know that that's what fuels me to do a good job at work. And so it's just, to me, it's something that I'm not kind of willing to compromise on. That being said, there are days and months where I do have to make compromises and I can't spend as much time with my family as I want. But I think someone was talking about this work-life balance one time, and I think instead of trying to think about it as something you need to achieve on a daily basis, it shifts depending on where you are and what your priorities are, and that's okay too. And having a support system, whether that is your husband, your friends, your family, like that. For me, I wouldn't have made it through residency unless I had friends who literally came over and slept at my house with my baby while I was on call at the hospital. So, I mean, it's just leaning on the people who you know and love.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this is not something that I've completely figured out. I'm the type of person that kind of bites off more than I can chew, and I keep on making that same mistake over and over again. And then I find myself just completely exhausted sometimes, like, very little sleep, and I'm just kind of sluggish through the day, and I end up being actually much less productive than on days where I just give myself some rest and kind of be a little bit more reasonable in terms of what I'm trying to do. What really helps me also is that my fiance is also a PhD student, and so we get a lot of support from each other, and we're kind of going through very similar paths, and just kind of having someone that you can talk to, I think, goes a long way. And don't be afraid to reach out. I think there's a lot of if you're at a university, there are a lot of programs that and counselors and kind of efforts to make sure we can maintain very good mental health even while we're being high achieving.
So thank you both so much. We're at the end of our hour. So I just want to thank Becky and Louai again for joining us today, and thank you all for being here. I want to pass it back to Olivia and Jessica to wrap it up in case they want to share anything.
Thank you, Panos. No, thank you for being part of this speaker presentation, and we hope to continue this in the future.
Yes, thank you. And Kathy, who worked at Kenyatta, sent us a link in the chat box of internships that are coming up in the summer for students who are interested. So be sure to check that out. And again, check out our website to see upcoming talks. And thank you everyone for joining us today.